at least the threat of that. Mary was very afraid. Joseph was very afraid. We talked a little bit about that last week as well. So what do you know about violence and its connection to Christianity? There's a lot of it. Yeah, sadly. Was there always a connection to violence and religion? Yeah. Say more about yes. And let me give you this.
Well, it's all over the Old Testament, and then you get Christians in, and they're persecuted. And then Christians have turned around and persecuted others. So it's kind of been a human foible that's been tied into religion for a long time.
So what do we know about the relationship to violence and the origin of our faith? Was this God's plan? It's a good question. Thank you, Debbie. I didn't realize that was going to have such a pause. Was this God's plan? What did Jesus do?
What was that?
As it relates to violence. Even as I asked that question, I realized that I've told several stories about Jesus' last visit to church. He was kind of a violent guy sometimes as well. But for the most part, for his ministry, what was the thing that he said and did?
Love one another.
Love one another. Love your neighbor. Was he persecuting people that didn't follow the way?
No.
No. Did he have a group of people around him that completely agreed with him on everything? No.
No.
What did he do to them? Nothing. What did he do to Judas?
Nothing.
Loved him. Gave him a kiss.
Forgave.
Felt really bad when everyone found him later. At the core of Jesus' ministry, and indeed in the Jewish faith before that, is a way of being that is non-violent. We often think about the Hebrew Bible and we say, oh, you know, God's an angry, vengeful God there in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. Maybe, but also maybe not. There's a story told there of correction, of covenant, of that movement back and forth, but the religious practice was focused on purity, worship, the tent of worship. It was focused on holiness, how someone becomes holy. Today is the first day of Hanukkah, so we begin to celebrate another growing light, just as ours kind of gets all completed. I get to light some more candles later. Those that are on vestry and search, we come to the house, look for that decoration. It will be pretty visible. So there's this idea of a growing hope, a growing faith, a purity that can be achieved by people that is non-violent. Then Jesus comes in and is essentially working against hierarchy, working against imperial structure from day one. So much so that he was a threat, and ultimately, as we know, murdered for that. And all along the way, he demonstrates nonviolence, even to the garden. Remember that crazy story where the disciples pull out a sword and chop off someone's ear, and Jesus fixes that and then tells them to put those away. Nonviolence is the way that works. So when in the world did the church become violent? Why did the church become violent? This is what Brian McLaren is asking us to consider in that second chapter.
No, I am the church.
So what do you know about it?
Why? Why do you suck it over?
What's the cause?
Well, it's like back to your question, is this God's plan? He knew human nature.
They wanted to take
And in human nature, we want to keep what we can get.
All right.
So sometimes we exclude other people or fight against them.
Yeah.
You know, was that, God knows our nature. How was that his plan? But it became a political organization. I mean, eventually, like Constantine when he became the Holy Roman Emperor, then it was
Yeah.
a way of
Yeah.
keeping your citizens united under one.
That's right.
You
Yeah.
set up rules and then you give permission to do follow.
So a lot going on in what you just said that McLaren does highlight. But yes, the quick answer is this small gathering of house churches began to meet, and in the midst of the powerful of the Jewish community, which is who these people were, they started to realize that they had even more influence over this growing number of people, and they were growing pretty rapidly in the beginning. And so as it goes, power corrupts. Absolute power absolutely corrupts. And here we are seeing this movement toward holding on to all of that influence. Sometimes that's used for good, sometimes it's not. In the church, we created a term that McLaren spends a lot of time helping us think about for how we determine who is someone standing in opposition to the church and therefore deserving of our churchly violence. We called them a heretic. What is a heretic? I love McLaren's definition of this. What is it to you? Say really quickly, what's a heretic? Someone define that.
Someone who speaks out against the church.
Someone who speaks out against the church. What else? So they're not just speaking out against the church like, I don't like red brick. Right?
Doesn't believe the right things or does believe the wrong things.
Doesn't believe the right things or believes the wrong things and says it out loud.
And tries to convince others of the same.
Correct. Right? So they're saying these things out loud. They're convincing other people, or other people are listening to them anyway. So they are a heretic because they're dangerous. McLaren begins this chapter by reminding us that the word heretic actually means none of those things, which I love. In its original context, heretic was a neutral word, is what he says. He goes on to define it. It was roughly equivalent to nonconformist, which is highly ironic. He later says, as Jesus was a brown Palestinian Jew, not white Jesus, not blonde hair, blue eye Jesus, a brown Palestinian Jew, someone who's part of a sect, even among Jewish people that have always been persecuted. This is the head of this new religion of nonconformist, nonviolent people. It wasn't until the Roman Empire was there that this became a threat, is what McLaren asked us to consider. And Debbie, you pointed toward where this actually shifted and became solidified. Constantine. What do we know about our history connected to Constantine?
Well, these ones were set, well, first Roman Empire, and set the head of religion for the nation.
He had a vision of his own right before a battle. Saw a cross in the sky, allegedly. Now he believes in Jesus. Why? Because he needed a holy reason to do the things he was doing. Where do we see that today? Or what relationship does that hold to the church today? This isn't a stagnant point in time, I think that Claire could make the argument. So what do you make of this? Why the church? Maybe it's a different question. Constantine could have had a vision for anything. He could have had a vision of something love in the sky and gone, you know what, the Roman Empire is going to be all about community building and dinner groups. But he picked the church. Why?
Because if you can co-opt a belief that's already firmly held for your own purposes, you can accomplish a lot. Not necessarily good things, but you can do a lot.
So if you can co-opt a belief that's already held, then you can do something and people will follow. So what did the church have as a belief structure that was useful as a tool for Constantine?
That the people that he was going after didn't believe in Christianity, therefore they would see that.
So maybe people he was going after weren't Christians, and they needed to see the light. Do you think Constantine cared about the spirituality of the people he was conquering?
No.
I don't know. So why the church? What did we have to offer to him? again, just like our story today, these things aren't stagnant. It always amazes me when I really stop to think about it. What's something that happens in the church without us having to work really hard? Identity. Okay. So you have a shared identity already, and because you do, my guess is that you care a great deal about all sorts of things that other people might think are not that important. Like, I wonder if anyone cares very much about all these crumbs on the carpet. I wonder if you'd be offended if I left them there, or if I stepped on them, or if I just vacuumed them up and put them in the wastebasket. In church, people are zealous. You are zealous. You have zeal. This isn't a negative thing, although we would use it generally in a negative or pejorative term today, right? When we see someone, we go, that's a zealot. But it's actually the beginning of something really good. You have zeal. You care about really interesting things. Some of them super important, some less important. You care. One of the things that's maddening about church is that everything is more significant than anywhere else in the world, because every single person that comes in and sits down cares about very specific things in very specific ways. The way you move, how you enter the room. Do you reverence the front of the room or the cross or not? Do you kneel? Do you sit? Do you kneel during prayers? Do you stand during prayers? Do you take wine or just bread or both? Are you upset about whether or not you get to use the chalice or not? You care about all sorts of things. And Constantine, as McLaren would help us to think about this, saw that as an opportunity. Because you care so much, there's a risk for you. There's a risk for me. Anyone want to guess what the risk is?
You might lose something you care about.
You might lose something you care about. And the idea of losing something you care about is, someone use a feeling word. If you're worried that you might lose something you care about, what's the thing you feel? Fear. Constantine, like most political leaders, capitalized on fear. He was a master of manipulation. The church is one of the easiest places to deploy manipulation. If you have never experienced a bad priest, God bless you. There are plenty of us that would do all sorts of manipulative things if you let them. There are plenty of Christians that sit in pews that do all sorts of manipulative things as well when they are left unchecked, because we all know that everyone here cares for you. Constantine knew that the only thing he had to do was put a little bit of fear into the midst of that equation, and suddenly he had an army of people that would be willing to deploy a different kind of warfare. These people were not going to be fighting on the battlefields. They were fighting the brains of the communities everywhere. It was masterful. From that point, our wagon has been hitched to this since then. We give moral authority to all sorts of violence. We perfected it at that point. We never stopped from that point. Anyone who chose something different than what the church said was at that moment dangerous and therefore needed to be dealt with. It wasn't until Constantine that we used that sort of violence. So how do we make sense of that? And how do we make sense about the fact that it's tied to the founding mothers and fathers of this religion? Brian McLaren talks about even Augustine, one of the folks most loved, most admired in the church's history, was one of the people that advocated for torture and death for people that disagreed. Not initially, but ultimately he did. Which points to the risk that we all have. So we know that this is part of our history. Where do you see it today? Do we still do it? Where do we do it? Do we do it here?
is all part of that violent history.
What else?
On the other side of that, if you're the person that feels that your things you care about are opposition to what the majority cares about, you may feel shunned.
So if you're a Christian and your views are not with the majority, you can feel shunned. What happens then?
And then often that person will leave without saying anything, and no one follows them out the door to say, why? Why are you leaving?
Yeah.
And sometimes they turn completely away from Christianity.
Yeah. It's really interesting, yeah. Sometimes they turn completely away from Christianity. Why is it so easy for people to be offended as a result of difference, and their quick answer is just leave? Why is that so easy for anyone? What's your guess on that? The sort of spiritual, I'm going to take my toys and go home. Not even worth trying to sort this out with you. I'm done. I'm leaving. Leaving St. David's. Never coming back. Why is that so easy?
Well, some churches actually do have the knockdown, drag-out fight.
Some do. Some have a knockdown,
It's
drag
not
out
the
fight.
St. David's way to have a knockdown,
Yeah.
drag-out fight.
But in a bigger sense, why do you think it's easy for people today to abandon a church, even one they've been at their whole life?
They just don't want to fight.
They don't want to fight? Maybe.
It's a way of making a statement.
It's a way of making a statement? Probably. I have a weird guess. And I think it has something to do with avoidance. None of us have the right to be here. None of us have the right to stay. None of us have the right to leave. People that walk away because I think we have never done the work of acknowledging some of the history that exists for us. It wasn't another culture that taught us how to deploy violence. We did it ourselves. We saddled ourselves to empire. Then later we saddled ourselves to colonial empire. And we just kept walking down that path of destruction and gain. We never once said anything about it. Once church leaders saw how effective violence was, they sanctioned it. McLaren talks about that in his book. Pope Innocent IV, 1252, issued a document authorizing torture for doctrinal nonconformists. If you didn't say out loud the same things, you had a holy mandate to torture. That same thing was used again and again through history. He notes a few things that I thought were really, really interesting. He talks about lynchings, also sanctioned by the church. 6,500 lynchings of black Americans during the Reconstruction in World War II. Used to frighten black Americans. He talked about the witch trials. Protestants perfected this. I thought this was really, really interesting. Starting in 1560, 80,000 women tried as witches, 40,000 of them killed. 90% of the trials took place in Protestant lands. Think about the position that we take on human sexuality today. Gay people, trans people, how they're allowed in or not. I've mentioned this before. There are body counts when we take these positions. These are all ways that we have taught ourselves that it's okay to allow something to take place as long as we aren't directly a part of it. But I think people leave because we are part of it. Every time we don't stand up for the people that are disenfranchised, we sanction those behaviors. Silence is a lot more to do with complicity than it does with making a statement. So I think there's something there for us in how we reach out to these people. He ends this chapter by saying, to state the obvious, Jesus never tortured or killed or ruined the life of anyone. but the same cannot be said for the religion that claims to follow him. Knowing what I know now, if I were not already a Christian, I would hesitate in becoming one, at least until the religion in all its major forms offers a fearless, searching, public moral accounting for its past crimes, first against Jews, and also against its own nonconformist members. Brian McLaren's words, once again, just right to the heart. I wonder, what are the things that we have to confess? I'd like to be able to solve all the world's issues, especially as it relates to the religion that would make me feel really good. I know I can't do that. But I can do something here, and you can too. So, what are the things that we have to confess? A fearless, moral confession of who we are, of who we're not, of what we believe, of who we speak for, who we stand with, who we walk with. I can't answer that question for you. But it's one of the things I love about Brian's work. He has this way of putting these statements out there so directly that you have nothing to do but to address them. To question where our faith, our tradition, our religion saddles itself to things that don't actually meet the standard of nonviolence that Jesus taught us. I've said before in other crowds, maybe with Brian's better words than mine, it'll make more sense. I believe that people choose not to come to church, not because they think we're full of it, but because they know we are. Do you get me? People in that bracket, that age group, that special magical group that's going to save the church, they don't trust us. They don't even trust me, even though I'm their age. I go hang out at all the cool places with them, do weird things there too, and they still don't trust us. Why? They're curious. They watch when we do theology in town. They talk to me when I go later in the week. I was there yesterday and forgot that I had a collar on still after delivering things. Took it off in the bar and said, "Oh yeah, you're in that place." Yet, there's a barrier for them. I am infinitely curious about that barrier. I hope that you are too. But I wonder what we have to say to people that are distrustful of us. How do we speak to their fears? How do we deploy nonviolence in that space? What are your thoughts about this? Or maybe you have something else you want to think about. This is a heavy topic today. Well, maybe I'll push you a little. Where do you see your faith being used in a public setting in a way that you find abhorrent?
Where do I not?
Where do you not? Okay. Fair enough. Where do you not? Say more about that.
Well, it's, you see, you see faith being deployed as an organizing principle. I think I see faith being deployed as an organizing principle for a lot of political campaigns. I'm sure there are people who are diametrically opposed to me on the political spectrum, and they see the same thing. And from
Where else do we see it? Do you see it? I also welcome the thought that it's not used poorly. Love playing devil's advocate. Where do you see your faith being used well in the public setting? Should faith be spoken about publicly?
See, in soup kitchens and halfway homes, feed my starving children, are all things that are faith-based, helping others without asking for anything other than just hands-on or help to help others.
Is that true?
I think it is true for, there are some organizations that is less true.
Yeah. I remember years ago going to serve food at a shelter and was told before the meal could be offered, everyone had to sit through a 5-minute discussion and prayer. Regardless of what they thought or believed, before they could get their food, that's what they had to have. Is that a good use? I think not.
Manipulation.
It's a little manipulative, isn't it? When you go and prepare something, and then before anyone can walk away, it has to be blessed, and everyone has to stand around and pray over it. Is that okay? I think the answer is always to these things. Maybe. Depends. Depends on the setting. Depends on who's there. Did we ask the question? You know, what do you do? I mean, it's what I love about McLaren's work. How do you negotiate these things for yourself, where you are? How do you seek permission in a group to express your faith? How do you engage with people that might have a different expression of faith? I've said it to a few people. Tonight's party at the rectory for our leadership group, you're going to get to come into contact with one of those things just in broad daylight. On one side of the room is a Christmas tree, and on the other side of the room is a lit menorah, because tonight is the first night of Hanukkah. Welcome to the complexity that is my home. How do we negotiate that? It's another way of thinking about, do we stop and think about the implications of even seemingly simple things like praying, or blessing something, or blessing someone, for that matter. I don't know if you've noticed when there are children around. I do two things. Number one, I ask them and their parents, would they like communion? If they say no, the next question I have is to the child. Is it okay if I touch you? I'm going to bless you. If they say no, okay, you're blessed. That's your body. You get to make that choice. But little bitty things to bring people into that, to give them autonomy over themselves and over their expressions and what they receive as an expression of faith as well. We have some work to do on that. So I wonder, this is a good time. It's Advent. It's time for you to slow down and contemplate all sorts of things. Think a little bit about what it is that we have to confess here at St. David's. Not picking on the place. Love this place. It's great. But my guess is that part of our history is also something that is largely unacknowledged. It's largely something we don't speak about. But we would fool ourselves to think that no one in the greater Glenview area knows that history, knows that story, even the one that we don't speak. So I wonder what work we have to do. I wonder how we talk about the violence done, the the ones that we do and the violence done on our behalf. I wonder what we're called to beyond that. All the stories that we tell during this time seem to be pointing us to a different direction. And the question is, are we looking? Some days, yeah. Other days, not even. I do it too. So this is maybe one of those moments to think about how we express that as a community and what we're called to. And think about how it ties itself into the liturgies that we will keep doing over this holiday. That we'll stay in this moment of stillness, that by the 24th we will leave in stillness and quiet. And then on the 25th, when most of you are headed somewhere else, we'll come back in here and we'll celebrate a new story. All along the way, we have a choice. What other questions or thoughts do you have in closing today? Yeah.
I think in the Christian community, not only today but in the past, that different portions of that community don't necessarily feel Christ-like, for lack of a better term, against other Christians. And it may not be in violence as much as just acceptance. Acknowledgement, inclusion. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is, when my dad was serving in World War II, you don't really find a whole lot of Eastern Orthodox churches in the U.S. So he went to church every Sunday wherever he could go to church. When he got back home on leave, his Monsignor chastised him for not going to Eastern Orthodox churches. To the point where, after he had been an altar boy all his life, just walked away from the church.
Yeah.
You know, this is the hypocrisy, if you would, of the church. You fast forward, and I look at the academic world, and Christian schools basically won't look at faculty members who are part of that sect, that religious Christian family. You just can't get there. When you look at the faculty profiles, you look at everything that is related to who they want to see and who they want to be part of the faculty. If you're not in that church, you don't have a chance. They just want you to think about it. So that exclusion, that passive violence, if you would, is there today, and it's universalized. And the only way to break that is just to do the behavior. And you go back to your other question, and that is the best way any of us can exhibit that is how we react to adverse situations. And if we handle those in a Christ-like manner, that's the best message we can give, because it doesn't show any hypocrisy. Even in the face of hypocrisy, in the face of violence, even in the face of any type of disrespect.
Yeah, knowing that those examples that you point to, I start to think about how we can deploy that here as an alternative, right? So the question becomes, what voices are silenced, even at St. David's? Because that's the church we're called to serve and love. That's the reason we ask these questions here. So what voices are silenced here, whether we intend it or not? So how do we make sure that there's no one on our proverbial faculty that's getting kicked out or are not considered? And perhaps that's a prayer that's significant now more than ever, because you're about to start getting the applications of all sorts of priests. And my guess is they look and sound different than you might even imagine. The candidates you get might look, God willing. So, what are the voices on your family that are at risk of not being heard? And how do you build a world where that's not the case? And where do you see that, as you describe, which I think is a beautiful term, I'm going to remember it and steal it from you. Passive nonviolence. Or passive violence, rather, by silencing. So when you hear a discussion that is seeming to leave a voice out, what's your role? What's your responsibility as a member of this beloved community? Are you to walk by? Because, whoever said whatever was said is a beloved parishioner. You don't want any problems. Are you to react to that in some way? What is a nonviolent reaction to that? Good thing for us to consider. Because my guess is you'll hear it, right? It's like the statement of, if it's written in the Bible, there was something happening in the time. People were trying to figure it out. So if we're thinking about someone potentially being at risk of being left out or silenced, or there might be some conflict, my guess is we're thinking about that because we're pretty sure it's going to happen. And that's a good instinct, because you're trying to figure out what's your role in it. So what does that look like here? How do you advocate for what the Spirit is bringing you versus the expectation that you might have? Because today in our readings, if Joseph had stuck with the expectations he had, Mary would have probably died in childbirth, and if she hadn't been lucky enough to die in childbirth, she would have lived in eternal poverty because he dismissed her gracefully. So how do you respond to the Spirit here? Something to think about. What else? Anything else in closing? You guys have been kind of quiet today. Well, I'm grateful for your thoughts, for your prayers, for your silence. I know there's a lot that's happening even in that. Continue to read this book. The next few chapters, we are probably going to end up ultimately skipping over. Just because of a time issue. But I do want you to do a little bit of homework. I want you to explore the church's relationship to colonialism and really think about what that means for us. I also really want to commend your attention to Christianity's loyal company. Talking about me, my friends. Read those chapters. Think about those relationships. The next time that we read together is another super fun one. And thankfully, we will be finished with our stewardship drive at that point, but we're going to talk about Christianity's real love, money. Okay? So, deep breaths. The next time we read together, we'll read that chapter. I hope that you will read the other two before it, because they are very, very important, but we won't be able to get to everything. So thank you for everything today. Keep in mind that in the coming week, on December the 25th, there will be no formation. So go and have Christmas with your family and with those people that you hold most dear. On January the 1st, we're having Christmas lessons and carols, and following that service, there will not be formation. So happy holidays. You get 2 whole weeks off to rest your brains and read those 2 chapters and be ready to come back and meet again on January the 8th. And I, for the life of me, can't remember exactly which one that is, but my thinking is it's Stump the Preacher again. So thank you for being here today. For those of you that are part of the vestry, the staff, or the search committee, I'll see you later. You're going to enjoy the food. Otherwise, remember that folks will be visiting today if you haven't already received your gift bag from St. David's. And I look forward to hearing back from you about that. Would anyone like to close us in prayer today? The Lord be with you. Gracious God, we thank you as always for the gift of our time together. The time to gather and think and pray. Even in moments of our silence, speak Speak, Lord. Trouble our hearts. Remind us that our work is a continued struggle until everyone is free. Bless us. Bless those who we love. Keep our eyes on those who are in need of your love, especially now. All these prayers we raise to you in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, my friends, thank you.